At this point, I'd like to introduce Tom Hassan, President of School Year Abroad, to make some introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Susan, and welcome one and all. I'm so delighted that we're together today to continue a conversation that's happening not only nationally but worldwide about bias. And I'm delighted to be joined by SYA members. As I look down, they're all Ren folks for us. We have Robin Hauser, who's class of France '82. And Robin, a very special thank you for giving us exclusive access to your film Bias, and I can't wait to hear more about that. Bryan Simmons, who's France class of '78. Hi there, Bryan. And Holland Lynch, I see quite often. She's a trustee. Holland is France class of '86. Before we move to the program, I just want to take one moment because I often get questions about how things are going at SYA, and I've sent out information, and we knew over the summer that the consulates were not opening, and so we would not be able to get students over there in the fall. We hoped and worked hard to see if we could get them over in January, but all of us have seen what has happened not only in Europe, but now a few weeks later, really kind of happening in America. And so for safety reasons and ability that kids really couldn't get the full SYA experience, we will not have students over there this year. That said, we are recruiting for next year's class. And the best thing that folks can do for us is spread the word. And sometimes you spread that word and instantaneously a student will apply. Sometimes you plant the seed and a few years later it will grow, and students will say, I remember that conversation back when I really want to go do SYA. So word of mouth is our strongest admissions recruiting tool. So please get out and spread the word, and I thank you for that. Also, what's happening right now, we just have our faculty come back on a nearly a full-time basis to work on next year's program. They're also connecting, you'll hear some news that will be connecting with alums later on this spring. And so I'm delighted that we could support our faculty who are just the lifeblood of what we do day to day, and they are so loyal to us, and delighted that they're now back. Meanwhile, our admissions team, as I said, is out there recruiting. Actually, they usually do that in person, but they, like us, are used to the Zooms, and they are connecting with students and parents throughout the world and talking about SYA. And finally, I want to thank Susan, whose voice you heard at the beginning. She and the team and the advancement team have been doing a tremendous job organizing such videos and webinars, and you'll hear, as I said, many more to come, and they are archived. So please take a look and see what we've been talking about, including our campaign, our first ever comprehensive campaign for SYA that will end this year. And we've done a number of webinars. So with all of that, let me turn to today's program and introduce more fully Holland Goss Lynch, who's France class of '86. Holland actually went to the Hotchkiss School and found out about SYA, went over to France, afterward headed to Georgetown, where she studied French Lit, and then on to University of Holland, where she earned a master's degree in library science and medieval history, and then worked at the exhibition program at the New York Public Library. We now find her out on the other coast. She is in San Francisco with her wonderful family, whom I've had a great chance to meet and dine with, including their great big dog, Leo. And so it's just delightful to have Holland not only hosting us today and moderating this panel, but also as a trustee. She volunteers a lot of her life to SYA and other causes. So with that introduction, Holland, thank you so much. And also thank you, Bryan, and thank you, Robin.
Thanks, Tom. This is really such a wonderful opportunity to delve into a very meaningful topic. I'm delighted to be speaking with Robin and Bryan today. And by way of introducing them, well, Robin, as we heard Tom say, is class of France '82. She is an award-winning director of documentary films at Finish Line Features. Bias is her most recent film. And of course, we'll be talking about all of the issues that it addresses today, or as many as we can get to. She has also had the opportunity to address many of these issues on the TED stage and at TEDx. Her work has premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival, the White House, and it's caught the attention of the international tech industry, policymakers, and educators around the world, and rightly so. Robin has been featured in international publications, and she's appeared on several media outlets. And in her role as a diplomat for the American Film Showcase, Robin speaks about unconscious bias, the importance of diversity and inclusion, and on behalf of women's rights at US embassies, conferences, and corporate headquarters worldwide. She's currently working on a new film, Savvy, about women and financial wellness, which I know we are all anticipating, excited about, anticipating excitedly, there we go. So Robin attended school year abroad as a senior from Lake Wilmerding High School here in San Francisco. Then she attended UC Berkeley, where she received her bachelor's in international marketing and French literature. Then she received her international MBA in international management, Japanese and French from the Thunderbird School of Global Management. And she's joining us today from her office in Newport Beach, California. So thank you for being here, Robin, and welcome.
Thanks, Holland.
Bryan is class of 78 in France. I do feel like we should do some kind of a cheer, a shout out to Ren, that we're all three Ren alums. He has over 30 years of global experience in communication, brand management, and integrated marketing campaign development. He began his career at Straton Advertising and Public Relations and has held a number of executive positions in marketing and communications at Lotus Development Corporation and IBM Corporation. He is on the board of many organizations, Cambridge Health Alliance, and has served on the board of Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, ACLU Massachusetts, Commonwealth Shakespeare Company, AIDS Action Committee of Massachusetts, and Primary Care Progress. Bryan attended school year abroad as a junior from Phillips Exeter Academy, earned a bachelor's degree in European history from Harvard College, and he's a past class correspondent for the class of SYA France 1978, and also served as co-class agent following SYA France's 50th anniversary. And Bryan joins us today from his home in Somerville, Massachusetts. So welcome, Bryan, and thank you so much for being here.
Delighted.
So I thought we would, and welcome to all of our attendees too. There are quite a few of you out there. It's funny for me to be speaking to so many people that I cannot see, but delighted to know that you're there. I'm picturing you all. And I would really also like to thank Brad for making this discussion possible. And Robin, I'd like to start with you and asking you about the making of this film, Bias, which I hope our panelists have had, our attendees have had a chance to watch. But if not, I hope this conversation will get you even more excited to do so. I was your path from first hearing about implicit bias or being made aware of it to the point where you felt like, oh, this is something that I need to make a film about. This is so important that I need to devote years of my life and energy because it's so real. Was there a tipping point for you or a particular incident or anything that sent you in that direction?
Well, I think as a documentary filmmaker, we're always thinking about what is our next project. You know, what's interesting enough to spend 2 years making, and is it just, am I the only one interested in this, or will I have an audience? I actually had finished a film called Code Debugging the Gender Gap, which was about the lack of diversity in tech. And I was on a panel at a post-screening discussion somewhere. And I remember somebody from the audience asking a man that was next to me, how much unconscious bias had to do with the lack of diversity in tech. And I remember thinking, unconscious bias, what the heck is that? So this was back in 2015 or 2016. And I remember thinking that I sort of dodged a bullet because I didn't really understand what that term meant. And then I began to hear it more and more and more. And I began to research it. And then I was introduced to the implicit association test. And I took one of those and was sort of shocked by my results. And I had a meeting with my producer and editor at the time, and I said, I want to make a film about unconscious bias. I think this is fascinating because it's something that every human has, and yet we can't see it in ourselves. We can see it in other people, and think about it's this survival heuristic, so we all naturally have it, and yet how is it helpful or even useful in this modern world? Like that in itself, that dilemma fascinated me. And I remember my editors looked at me and scratched her head and said, what are we going to show on screen? And I said, we'll figure that part out, but let's find some really good stories. And so that's what made me want to dive into it.
That's great. The way you were talking about how it's something that is necessary to our, or had been necessary to our survival, but is now maybe is useless. It's like the appendix of,
Right.
I don't know, the mental appendix. So that's fascinating. And Bryan, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your interest in implicit bias and when you first started hearing about it, understanding it, if it played a large role in your career, and how you came to be interested.
Well, I mean, I've certainly been a stakeholder in the conversation, arguably my entire life here in this country. And, but I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, apart from my time at boarding school and obviously in school year abroad. I was born in Memphis. My mother still lives there. And that was obviously a very polarized city environment to live in and grow up in the 1960s, in the middle of the civil rights movement and some efforts to desegregate and so forth. So at least the race conversation, that discussion of bias was always right there in my everyday life. In my corporate life, I started getting exposed to it in a different way, perhaps in a more similar way to the way that Robin was just referring to it, because I actually went to work and people were talking about the fact that it existed. It wasn't just an us and them and how are we going to, how are we going to get paid fairly or how are we going to resolve injustices, but it was really, it had become part of corporate culture, of the day-to-day work culture of working people and managers. And I would say it became a mainstream concern. And yet I was still the same stakeholder that I was all along, but I started managing people and hiring people and being a part of a corporate workplace where actually some value was put on recognizing, identifying, and then resolving the effects of bias. So I grew up in that way. My interest grew. And my involvement grew through some of my my board service, for example, being a part of Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, where it wasn't just legal issues that we were trying to resolve around discrimination, but also recognizing that the root of discrimination is it's sometimes rather deliberate, and there's nothing unconscious about it at all. But a lot of the time, in fact, it is unconscious. So my interest has blossomed from all of those early experiences and been accentuated by recognition of the rest of the society that this is a real thing that has effects that we want to try to address.
Thank you. I think you touch upon something that I had been thinking about, which was explicit bias. Had been something that certainly I was very aware of in my own life, but the concept of implicit bias, of acting in a certain way without even realizing that was happening, or that unawareness was something that was new to me, and I was grateful to Robin's film, and then actually a talk for SYA that she did out here, gosh, a couple of years ago now. That was just lit a bulb for me there, and I have been particularly interested in the implicit association test that you talk about, and how that measures something that, as you say, with implicit bias, we can't see, and is very hard to define and hard to measure. So if I'd like to talk about the test, which you do cover in the film. Let's start by discussing that a little bit. I know you've taken it, Robin, and Bryan, did you take any of the?
I've taken several of the tests in the past 10 days.
Would you like to share your thoughts on?
Well, I'd love to hear what Robin has to say first, but I'm happy to talk about that experience, you know, at the right moment here.
Yeah, so it's hard to make a film about implicit bias without addressing at least the implicit association test, or the IAT, that Mahzreen Banaji and Tony Greenwald did and is now hosted on the Harvard site, because it was so sort of informative, right? And yes, there's been criticism about the IAT and about the efficacy of it, and whether or not it holds true for everybody. But I think there's one thing that is undeniable, and that's the reason that it's still even, you know, up on the website, is that it measures your associations between two things, right? And you can't cheat the test. Malcolm Gladwell actually said that when he was asked on Oprah about this. You cannot cheat the test. I mean, I could take the same test 3 or 4 or 5 times, and my results, if nothing in my life has changed, it's likely that my results on the test won't change. However, if I begin to act differently, or if I have a relationship suddenly with somebody or something that I was previously had a negative association or a positive association with, and then that association changes because of an experience I have, and I go back and take the IAT, chances are that will have shifted. And in fact, in the film, you see that I did a few tests like that, and in fact was able to slightly alter, you know, my associations. But what the IAT is measuring is societal's, as Mahzreen Banaji says, bias is the thumbprint of our culture on our brain. And what that really means is that it's not all, it's media, right? It's the films we watch, it's the news that we listen to or that we read. It's the books, it's movies, it's all of these things that are reinforcing certain associations, whether it's Black Americans and harmful objects, or you know, associations of, say, laziness around somebody who isn't the perfect body weight, right? Or say somebody's accent, Southern accents, for some reason. Hope I don't offend anybody here. I'm just, but for some reason, people with Southern accents aren't perceived to be as intelligent as somebody with a British accent, right? Well, that's fascinating. Why is it that we have those perceptions? But anyway, that's why we decided to use the implicit association test in the film as sort of a measure, because we did think that it was a really important tool in this discussion.
And I would say I was fascinated by something Robin said just a few minutes ago about certain functions of the brain being valuable at some other point in time. And you talk about this in the film too, that our brains are wired in a way to aid our survival. I mean, the bottom line is that we are built to survive. I mean, this is why newborn babies are born looking at every little tiny thing you do, because their brains, in order to survive, they have to mimic, and they have to learn how things work. And that thumbprint metaphor, I mean, I could translate it also into as if our brains are computer hardware, and the culture is code, is a language. And that's, the culture is writing code on us all the time. And then it prescribes the behavior. If then, that there you get into the associations. And so we're left with these atavistic mechanisms that might have kept us from being eaten by a bear 100,000 years ago, but are not useful to us right now. I did say I would share a bit about the tests that I took. It's hard to take those tests and face the results. And I took some of them twice because the mechanism of entry tripped me up a little bit. And I thought, well, I better take that again. Maybe my result was affected. And it did seem I got some change, but not a whole lot of change when I took something a second time. And at first I was a bit upset by some of the biases that that were identified for me. None of them was dramatic, but in a couple of instances, I had slight biases according to the result that were awfully ironic because they were, I took one about women and men and careers. I took one about gay and straight people. I took one about African-American children and children of European descent. And in some of those instances, I was really horrified that I could have even a slight unconscious bias and greater openness to those people. But then I think about my own real life experience as an American, and I talk about this a lot with friends, is that we kind of think about bias as it's a problem. It's the bias against women is a man problem. The bias against Black and brown people is a white problem. The bias against gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people is a cisgender, heterosexual problem, but it's not, because we all share the American gaze, if we're going to talk about America right now. And that the code has been being written on us our entire lives. No matter who we are in this country, we watch the same television, we've seen the same advertising. I've been very involved in advertising in my career, and there's a huge psychological basis to that. It's all built around people's aspirations and how they want to see themselves and who they want to become or who they wish they were. And so it's squared with my own experiences, because I can honestly say that back when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, I went over for a voice lesson, my first voice lesson on the other side of town, the other side of the river from Cambridge, and found myself in a neighborhood that was deserted. It was dark, it was winter. And I saw another Black person who wasn't wearing a tweed jacket and, and docksiders or whatever I was wearing. And I crossed the street. And right after I thought, what are you doing? You crossed the street to avoid someone who looks like you. And why did you decide that person was suspicious? So I'll stop there, but that's one important nugget I really like to share out in the open, because I think that the road to mastering the implicit and unconscious biases has to be that we need to be honest about the fact that these are challenges that are washing over all of us, and we need to attack them together and give each other space to mess up, to meet somebody and, confuse their name with the name of someone else who looks marginally like them, all those things.
Yeah, Bryan, I want to piggyback on that. I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's also interesting to think about some of the things that really fascinated me were, okay, so if this is a survival heuristic, right? If we have this because our ancestors needed to be worried and suspicious of people that weren't just like us, how is that useful in the modern world? And not to dive too deeply into sort of politics, but if you think about, say, our police force, think about what we're asking them to do. So as humans, we learn from experience. Literally since the moment we were born, we learn from experience. And as we get older, something as simple as, you know, you touch a stove when it's hot, you burn yourself. We're not going to touch that stove again. We have to learn. So imagine what we're asking our law enforcement to do. Just because they approached a car in a certain neighborhood and there was a certain profile person in the driver's seat that pulled a gun on them, doesn't mean that the next time they approach a car in the same neighborhood that they can make the assumption that a gun is going to be pulled again, right? You cannot, as law enforcement, make that assumption. But how do we disremember something, right? How do you as a human being forget something that's an experience that we've had? We don't do that very easily. And yet we're asking our police force, and they must do that. They must approach every new situation without, as they might call it, a training scar, right? They have to approach every new situation with a fresh, open perspective. And yet that can be a very dangerous thing to do. And yet it's also highly dangerous if they make the assumption that somebody's going to be dangerous or have a weapon or be a threat that isn't, right?
Yeah, I would say it's nearly unnatural to be able to, I mean, when you think about how much your survival does and your performance in life depends on what you can recall, all the little tiny lessons you learn, that not that was hot before, but you also, you know, that stove was hot before, but you also, a child learns very soon that something might be hot. There's just a lot of detail and nuance to and intuition to what we pick up, and it's very difficult to unlearn.
Absolutely, absolutely. Which is why, as we dive into this discussion about unconscious bias, and if we're really interested in self-discovery and thinking about, okay, now I realize that I have these associations, you know, you don't want to call them, if you don't want to call them biases, call them, you have these associations. They might be negative associations. They might be positive associations. We all have positive associations. If we had a good experience at our university or our college, we all have positive affirmations and experiences, right, with that college. Oh, we might give that person a little bit of preference because if we're interviewing them because they went to our college or because they went to SYA, right, for that matter. And we have to think carefully about, but is that person really the right candidate, you know, regardless. So it is highly complicated and yet crucial if we care about that. Now, there are people that say, well, it's something that I can't do anything about, so I you know, to make it as an excuse. And I just challenge that if you really care about your impact on the world and how your biases, your unconscious biases are affecting you, the friends you hang out with, the team that you build at work, you know, the types of publications that you believe and don't believe, all of these type of things. If you care about that, then the self-discovery, I think, is highly important. But we need to count on people around us to help us with this. Because just like you can't do 2 math problems in your head at once, you can't see the unconscious biases that you aren't aware of, right? But it's very easy to see them in other people. It's much easier for us to see bias in other people than it is for us to see in ourselves.
I think it's so fascinating to think about how we really are a product of our experiences. And I feel as a parent that puts tremendous pressure on, am I giving my children the right experiences to navigate the world appropriately? And as educators, certainly. What has changed in recent human history is, of course, the introduction of technology. And I think social media is it's a new experience for humans. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how it is impacting, it is an experience that is possibly increasing our bias and our associations in some ways, or is it allowing us to experience things that we wouldn't have otherwise? Is it a double-edged sword, or does the blade cut only one way or another?
Well, I'll just jump in to say that I think what social media is all about is perception, right? We present ourselves as we want people to perceive us on social media, whether we're, laughing it up with our friends, or, at a concert, or whether we're at our desk, or whether we're promoting our work and our business. So it's all about, right, perceptions. And bias and perception is something that's that's real, that all of us have. So for instance, if we present ourselves and somebody's sort of disheveled, right? Or think about the amount of, even, a little bit on the aside from social media, but just even doing Zoom links like this. If we choose a virtual background, viewers will think, well, why? Are they afraid of they're showing us their home, or are they not afraid of us they're showing this home? Is that, well, look, Bryan chose to wear a blue blazer. I mean, that looks great. He's nice and dressed up. And look, oh, Bryan's got a print in the background of Malcolm X, Is that Malcolm X? I think it is. And so, and so what is this? What do we, Robin's got a map with the world in back, but it looks kind of plain. What does that mean about my money, about my home, about anything? We make these sort of assumptions based on perception all the time. So it's complicated, and it's on social media, we can control that image. We all know about the horrible repercussions of social media. And if you haven't seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix, I highly encourage you to watch that. Some friends of mine made that documentary, and it's shocking. But how we can only control so many, ways that people perceive us, right? Based on how we present ourselves. And I think it's really interesting because that, as we say, first, what's your first impression? I mean, we all know that we are highly influenced by first impressions, and those are biases.
I would also say that throughout most of social media, which is powered by, funded by advertising, turns out everyone on social media is an advertiser. Everyone's Facebook page, and then all the ads that we see. And it works the same way as advertising always had, to which I alluded earlier, that people are, this is a medium for aspiration and for projecting. And to really know people in 3 dimensions and break through through bias, to know someone 3-dimensionally rather than knowing their Facebook picture or the video that you saw that they chose to edit and post, you have to have exposure to them over time to see them like a building, to see it from all sides, to see it at different times of day. That's when you really know someone, when you know them under stress, when you know them in different contexts, when you know how they behave in a room full of women, or a room full of Black and brown people, or a room full of people to whom they feel superior or intimidated, and so forth. So I think the limitations are the situations that we tend to avoid in our culture, which I'm going to not say plural, the situation that we tend to avoid in our culture is to be immersed with people who are different than we are. So our society is still very racially segregated, and it's very much segregated by class. People don't want that mixed income development to come across the street from them, because they want to stay with their peeps. And so they never get they might encounter people at the workplace, or they might even allow their kids to encounter them to some extent at school. But to go to church together, to live next door to one another, all those opportunities to get to that third dimension, the 3-dimensional familiarity, it's still rare.
Yeah, and Bryan, I just want to say that the extent to which that is conscious versus unconscious, a lot of what you're speaking about is like me bias, right? And I think that people like me bias can be very unconscious. For instance, if I'm interviewing 3 different people to bring onto my team, and one of them went to UC Berkeley, she's a runner, she likes to ski, she studied French, well, immediately I get it. I get that person. They're like a mini me. That's easy. I feel comfortable with that person. Candidate number 2 is somebody who grew up in the Midwest, isn't really very outdoorsy, lives with 3 cats. You know, I'm like, okay, I can't relate, you know, so much to that person. And I think that what's fascinating is that I automatically gravitate toward the person who is like me because it's who I feel most comfortable with. I didn't set out to say, I want to hire somebody who's just like me. No, consciously, I know that hiring for diversity is going to be the best thing to do. Because if I have diverse opinions, I already have my opinion. I already know my opinion. I need to bring other opinions in to be able to create something that might, you know, products that serve a greater breadth of humanity, for example. But my gut is going to be telling me that I feel safer with the candidate that's just like me. And so that is why it's so important to make sure that I don't make the only decision, that I bring a diverse panel in to say, let's all collectively look at all of these candidates. Who do you think is best? And to really be able to step out of your own constraints, right? To try to understand who is, because I don't know about you, but I was raised on follow your gut. Well, Robin, what does your gut say? Go with your gut. And everything I've learned from making this film is slow down and question your gut. Your gut might not be leading you to the right, fair decision.
I think it was fascinating in the film when I believe it was Mahzarin Banaji was explaining that we use a different part of our brain to or a different part of our brain gets activated when we're interacting with somebody we feel is like us and with somebody that we feel is different from us. So is part of the way to combat bias to try to bring more, and it's a little bit what you were saying, Bryan, to try to bring more people that feel that we would be interacting with in that difference part of the brain into the part of the brain where we feel similarities, and is to build bridges of understanding and empathy with people who are different, so that we start to see their interests as our interests and subtly then change. You know, we remove our bias or we bring them into a positive bias. Maybe that's what we're talking about. But is that debiasing the brain, or is that, you know, is that shifting the bias?
Well, it sounds compelling to me, and perhaps like you, I'm overstepping my authority to speculate in the realm of science, but it does seem, at least it might be a very effective trick, right? Because back to the notion of getting to that know someone in 3 dimensions. If you have exposure, you may get to that place where they migrate from being different to your brain's point of view to actually being someone who your brain decides that you have a lot in common with this person. Whereas at the beginning you saw them as different, but now you don't, because you talk to them long enough to find out just what your Venn diagram looks like. And it's a lot more overlapping than you thought.
Yeah, so what Bryan's, if I may, Bryan,
Please.
referring to is this difference between in-group and out-group, right? And what Mahzarin Banaji was talking about is that scientifically our brains think about people that are in our in-group differently. That is not something that we can actually control. We can't say, okay, brain, start thinking about that in the frontal cortex as opposed to, you know, the back or whatever. So we have to find hacks to be able to get over these biases. And so as Bryan was saying, well, I've talked to somebody long enough, I have a different perception of them now. One of the things that they have realized works in order to change our perceptions is to spend qualified time with someone. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I have a strong bias against anybody who's Muslim, and I'm fearful, and I have this association of Muslims and you know, terrorist acts, right? And then at work, I am suddenly paired with a Muslim, and I have a 3-month project that I do with this Muslim woman, for example. If I were to take an association test after that, it is highly likely that if my experience with this Muslim woman was really good, and I begin to realize that she is a human just like I am, that just because of her religious affiliations to Islam doesn't mean that she's a terrorist. I become educated in that way, and my biases begin to fade, as long as that experience continues to be positive, right? And so that is what's so important. And that's why we all need to avail ourselves to diversity and to people and to things that are different than us with open minds, because that is how we change. What's fascinating was I remember asking Mahzarin once when we were it was after the film, and I said to her, are people in New York City more or less biased than people in a small town in Ohio? And I thought I knew the answer. I thought the answer would be, oh, Manhattan, people in New York City, they're much more worldly, they're exposed to much more diversity, they're going to be much less biased. And in fact, the opposite is true, is what Mahzarin told me. And the reason for that is because when we have tons of stimulation that comes to our brain, what we do as humans is we categorize things, because that's what makes it easy for us. Oh, you run a deli, you must be Jewish. Oh, you're a white woman, you must have gone to Princeton. I get my newspaper from the Middle Eastern community every morning, right? So we are getting my fingernails done, they must be Vietnamese. And we categorize the world in that way, because that makes it make sense to us. So if I meet somebody Vietnamese, it's hard for me to think of anything else than, do your parents run a nail salon? Now, and that's obviously highly biased and incredibly unfair, but it's what our minds do. Whereas if I grew up without much exposure at all to diverse people, I don't yet have those associations unless I've learned them from media or something. And so that to me was really fascinating. I thought that was interesting. And I think that for most of us, we've had this unique experience to have lived in a foreign country. And whatever, preconceived notions we had about the French or about Italians or about the Chinese, as we say, right? We then live in families, meet people, we love it. We love their culture, or perhaps we have some things that we learn about it that we didn't so love, and that creates sort of different biases. But that rich experience that we had immersing ourselves into another country is what's afforded us to not make gross generalizations and assumptions, right, about a whole group of people. So to me, that's fascinating.
And as you spoke, a quick sidebar, because I'm so thankful for the experience that I had in Rennes. But I've looked back and realized that I'm pretty sure that when I arrived at Exeter and had to decide what foreign language I would study, I've gone back to think, why did I choose French? Why did I not choose Spanish, which as an American, today would be just much more useful on a day-to-day basis. And I'm pretty sure that my only exposures at that time to anything Spanish, because in Memphis, Tennessee in the 60s and 70s, you were just either Black American or you were white American. And if you were anything else, I joke, I had to go to Exeter to meet a Puerto Rican. I think all my images of Spanish-speaking people were the Frito Bandito in the Frito Bandito advertising, or the gang members in West Side Story. And I saw French as having much more to do with my aspiration to be sophisticated and worldly. But it all worked out. But it's ironic that an experience that's so edifying could be grounded in just the kind of thing we want to put to bed.
Yes, absolutely. I think maybe Holland fell off for a minute, so I'll just take over. There was a question about the police training that was in the film, the assimilation and the counter bias training simulation that was at the University of Spokane, Washington, that was being tested throughout the country. And I don't know if it's still that the film came out in 2018, so I am still in contact with Lois and Steve James, but I don't know if that's still working. The interesting thing is that some of the results of that lab was that when the police officers took the training and then took the IAT, what they found was that they were they were so aware of their potential biases that they almost they knew about it, and so their behavior was affected by it, but almost too much in a way, right? So we understand that, oh, I might be biased, and therefore in front of any person with dark skin, I am gonna not do anything violent, right? And we know that that doesn't necessarily solve the problem either, right? I mean, hopefully there are less useless deaths in that case, but if a policeman's job is to protect the public, then there are going to be times that in front of anybody, regardless of their skin color, who is dangerous, they need to act appropriately, right? Yeah, but there are a lot of different tests, I think, going on that are working toward trying to figure out how to train police officers to be able to confront their own biases and unconscious biases, more importantly, or equally important.
You see the other question, Robin?
Let's see, I'm just looking at it now. There's a school of thought, Malcolm Gladwell, that it may be more effective to ditch in-person interviews for jobs because first impressions are not actually all that accurate and important, and two, that our bias plays a role we're not even aware of. Do you think there's some merit to this? Yes. So the idea of non sort of in-person, this is really interesting because I think during COVID this has been happening more and more. But this, my daughter went through 5 interviews with a company, and none of them were face-to-face. Thought that was very interesting. And it wasn't until sort of the last minute that she was then invited onto a Zoom and then to in-person. And so I think absolutely there's merit to that, right? Because of our bias and perception, the minute we see somebody, we see their skin color, we see their, we see everything, you know, a lot about them, as much as we can, as many assumptions as we can make, which of course we shouldn't, but from seeing somebody. So I think that's important. You know, there's also been a lot of really interesting studies about how when you take somebody's name off of a resume, so you take off name and race and just look at qualifications, how that has made people of color rise to the top levels of candidates at companies. Because there was a really interesting study that was done, or a man wrote his name as Joseph. I think it was like Joseph Thomas versus Jose Martinez, right? And it was fascinating to see how many more interviews he got when his name was Joseph as opposed to Jose.
I would say there might be some merit to thinking about a hybrid approach where the first couple of rounds are not face-to-face and have removed some of these, the risk that you were just describing. Because in a normal environment, when we're not on Zoom all of the time and the job is not, getting the job done in some realms, getting the work done is a lot to do with collaboration and other habits that people might have that you're not going to see in the interview that's not face-to-face. And you need to put a candidate at some point when you have finalists, depending on what it is you're going to have them ultimately doing, you may need to put them in a social situation where they can be observed for more than 20 minutes, how they interact with other people.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that there is a combination of that. I think that both of that is important. And by the way, not to say that you should totally disregard your gut, right? You just have to make sure that that your gut is based on facts that actually matter. And I think that's really important. There's also a question here that could you comment about the use of AR, augmented reality, to debias the brain? So augmented reality and virtual reality there are tools being developed to help us get over some of our biases or debias the brain. I want to preface this by saying that I don't think we will ever completely debias our brains. I don't think it's humanly possible yet, but we know that we can alter some of our biases. And so by putting on these head-mounted displays and having a rich experience inside augmented reality or virtual reality, with something that you're biased about. Let's just say I'm terrified of dogs because I was bit by one when I was 2. And I have an experience through either augmented reality or virtual reality where I learn, I have this really unique, wonderful experience with a dog, or that can help change my perception. So you could do the same thing. It can also build empathy. What if through augmented reality or through VR, we could see what it's like to be the only person of color in the room, or the only woman, or what's it like to be, interrupted all the time in a meeting? And so to suddenly change our perspective and be introduced to what it's like to be, for someone else to be in somebody else's shoes, it builds empathy. And building empathy is a really important step toward changing our bias. Holland, welcome back.
Thank you. I apologize. I don't know what happened, except that maybe we have 3 people in school in our house and everybody got on at one time. And I assume the conversation was riveting and wonderful. There's a great question that I have just seen from Woody Halsey, which I think I was going to ask this question in some way myself, but can you think of specific examples from your experience at SYA that helped you begin to debias your brain?
So yes, I'm reading the question also, and I love that you say from SYA. Specific examples. I mean, I will tell you that my experience within the film when I was in Barcelona inside virtual reality, and I had this experience with a Black woman, I was deeply changed by it. In virtual reality, I looked down, I was playing this virtual game, and my partner was a Black woman. And then the voice in my head said, look down at your own skin. And I said, well, I don't see myself, and it's because I was Black. And I then had this experience, we played the game again. And what I learned is that, I think you saw this in the film, I mimicked her behavior when I was in Black skin, because suddenly we were in the same in-group. And I had this empathy, and I felt more one with her because we were similar. Now, obviously, I walked out of that experience as a white woman, and there's only a certain, to a certain extent that I can actually keep that empathy and change, because the truth is I don't know what it's like to be a Black woman. But it did have this profound effect on me that has made me sort of stop and think when I am sort of in a situation where a person of color is in the room with me and is the one or the only or the one of few. And so just even making me aware of what that might feel like for that person, I think was very rewarding and helpful to try to, debias, or at least again, to build empathy. Bryan, what about you?
Well, I would say I'm sitting here, I'm struggling to think about an experience that I reached for purposefully. I think I've had many that came to me, and they were of the kind, I sound like a broken record, but it's all experiential for me. It hasn't been a body of work of inquiry for me. But I have definitely held biases in the past. Certainly there was a period, my relationship to transgender people is very different now than it was 15 years ago. I made all sorts of assumptions about trans people. I thought I would notice, for example, that when I met anyone who was a trans woman or a trans man, that their gender presentation seemed consistently to be so extreme, that so utterly feminine or so hyper masculine, that I would see them as inauthentic, and I would also assume that they might be hostile to anyone who presented somewhere in between those two extremes, me as a gay man, for example. But I had experiences of through my work of being exposed to more of those people, being in extended conversations with them, managing someone on my team who was actually going through a series of gender affirming surgeries, and gradually changing pronouns and so forth. And what I just came to understand better, that some of that presentation is about banging so hard on a door to get people to see you and recognize you the way that you see and feel yourself. So I went to a place of not understanding, and actually a place of not really much empathy at all, to a completely different place. And now I don't have to do work to get there. When I meet a trans person, I really think I've undone some of the coding. So that's one example.
Well, thank you. I just reflecting on my own SYA experience, I think that that year, one of the unexpected things I had to manage was being the person in the room who had to explain herself, because I had grown up, always feeling very comfortable in all of my environments. And I learned being an American that people were projecting things onto me. The French, had conceived ideas of Americans that they were projecting onto me, that I had to work with to overcome and to explain that I was me and not representative of an entire group of people. And that experience really stuck with me, and I think has helped me to look at people as individuals, not having to speak for every single person that looks like them or speaks like them or has had, or is the same nationality. So I don't know. That stuck with me a lot. We are getting close to the end of our hour, and it's been so great. I don't know if Robin and Bryan, you could stay on for just a couple of minutes. We've had some great questions, and we'd like to get to them all. So maybe we'll just do perhaps two more questions. So one that we have gotten is, Robin, if you were to do a sequel, are there any particular developments you would address or new research that you would highlight?
Wow, I think I would love to dig a little deeper into law enforcement, police force bias, and to really dig into that. I feel like we just sort of combed over it, just touched on it, right, in the film. So I think that would be interesting. It could be a whole film in itself, and whether some of these simulators are actually having a real effect, on that, because obviously that's a really big issue in our society today. There's a film that came out, it went to Sundance in 2019, might have been 2020 actually, might have just been January, almost a year ago, that is called Coded Bias. And I believe Netflix just picked it up. So that's an interesting film if you want to dig a little deeper into bias. Coded Bias. It's all specifically about bias in artificial intelligence and in facial recognition. And there's a pretty poignant scene where a group of young men or a group of school kids, right, were coming from, I think, high school in the UK. I think it was out in London, and they're in school uniforms. and there happens to be a van sitting on the side of the road that's got, you know, one of those cameras that are searching, and it identifies one of these, you know, youth school kids' face. He happened to be Black. It identified him as a potential risk, or as a, you know, as a fugitive. And they jumped out of the van and pulled him aside in front of all of his classmates and everything. This kid in his school uniform, you know, pulled him aside. He was probably no more than 16. And they said that he had been, you know, identified as a criminal that was wanted for a crime, all based on facial recognition. And then, of course, eventually they had to let him go, but not after this horrible incident of racial profiling based on artificial intelligence. And so I think this is, I did a TED talk on bias in artificial intelligence, and I think that it's just a huge problem, because I thought, well, this is really fabulous. You know, if as humans, we'll never become perfect. We'll never de-bias ourselves completely. Maybe artificial intelligence is the answer. Maybe computers are the answer because they don't have human brains. And, you know, what I learned through research is that, in fact, artificial intelligence is already biased. Number one, because we as humans are programming bias right into it. Two, we're using biased data, right? Historical data, especially in law enforcement, is biased. And three, because it's so easy to just put a data error, right? A typo. But that's something that also that I think is really interesting. And I would, if I were to do a sequel, I would dig deeper into bias and artificial intelligence and how that might play out in the future, which is fairly alarming.
We'll look forward to seeing that. And so our last question, which I'm going to try to merge two questions that we have gotten, is about helping others to de-bias their brains, whether we are teachers working with students or individuals working on ourselves, friends trying to help other friends who may not think they have biases. What are some ways that we can all work to start counteracting the negative effects of this implicit bias, I think is the way to put it.
Bryan, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, this is going to be a lay comment, because I can't claim, again, that this is my specialty, or that I've even spent as much focused time researching it. But I mean, I just think that the first step here is to create safe environments for people to admit and confront that they do have bias. So the number one thing is to be vocal if you are someone who recognizes that you do have bias, and you don't feel that that should be stigmatized, but that should be actually treated socially as an opportunity to share and learn and work on this all together with other people. As I mentioned before, that we all have this washing over us. I mean, I think just creating opportunities to be explicit and honest about it so that others can do the same, because people don't really work on this in secret. They work on it with the encouragement and awareness of their friends and social circles and colleagues. So I would say that, and I would, if I were in the audience here, I would talk about this. I would talk about this webinar. I would tell people to see Robin's movie, to see Robin's documentary. I would encourage people to go and take the tests, because the test is really a huge provocation for people to shed the stigma and recognize that it's something that's rather stealth, and that everybody is dealing with it.
Yeah, I agree with Bryan, and I would also say that we all tend to think of ourselves as the victim, right? And if you are a person of color, or if you are a woman, or if you are extraordinarily tall or extraordinarily short, or, you know, whatever, if you feel like you've been a victim of bias, it's hard to get beyond that to think of yourself as perhaps a perpetrator of bias as well. And so it's really important to try to encourage somebody to think of, but what's their contribution to this? Because we are all biased, everyone is. So taking the implicit association test is one way to do that. And what I usually tell people when they say, what can we do about this? Slow down. We all need to slow down. And that goes completely contrary to everything else the world is suggesting that we do, right? In a world where you just have to get 100 things done today really quickly. But we need to slow down and try not to make snap judgments or quick decisions that aren't based on facts that really matter. We need to seek out opinions from people that are different than us. So for instance, for me, if I'm making a film and I just think, oh, this one person is just bugging me, I really want to pull their bite from the film. Well, that might be because they remind me of my ex-husband, or something, I don't know. And I have to make sure that the decision I'm making isn't one based just on my bias, but is something that really warrants that type of reaction. So I need to bring in my diverse team and say, okay, this bite's bothering me in the film. Can it please disagree with me if you feel like let me know if you think we should keep it and why. And I have to be available I have to listen to that feedback, right? I have to be able to understand that that I might be coming from a place of bias. And so I think that when we can look inward and realize that we have this in us and we trust people around us to gently, let us know that maybe you're making that decision out of bias rather than a really important fact that'll have grave significance. I think that that's going to make a big difference in the world.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you, Bryan, too. I think we need to wrap up. But I'd like to thank everybody who has attended today for joining us. And I encourage you all to keep up with SYA and stay involved and engaged. We will follow up with a survey, and Robin has agreed to share some additional materials related to the webinar so that we can all continue our learning here. And really just on behalf of SYA, thank you, Robin. Thank you, Bryan, so much for your time today. Robin, thank you for sharing your film with us and access to it with all of us. It's been a great conversation. I've learned an enormous amount, and I've really loved speaking with both of you. So thank you, and happy holidays to everybody.
Thank you.